What you have just witnessed over the last 72 hours marks a turning point in the global order as we have known it for generations. This is not another routine geopolitical headline. This is not another diplomatic disagreement that will quietly fade away. This is a structural rupture. While most people were distracted by domestic political theater, celebrity scandals, and a short-term market noise, three major economic actors made coordinated moves that strike directly at the foundation of American global power. Not with missiles, not with tanks, but with something far more consequential. They moved against the dollar. Russia, China, and Mexico, three countries with very different histories, ideologies, and relationships with Washington, have just taken actions that, when viewed together, signal something unmistakable. The era in which the United States could unilaterally enforce its will through financial dominance is rapidly coming to an end. And the most important part? Washington understands exactly what is happening. The question is not whether the system is changing. The question is whether we, as citizens, are prepared to understand the consequences of living through the collapse of a unipolar world and the birth of a multipolar one. Let me explain exactly what is happening here. Because what you're seeing in the headlines barely scratches the surface of a transformation that has been decades in the making and is now accelerating in real time. When the United States announced its latest round of sanctions against Cuba, officials framed the move as a continuation of long-standing policy. But this was not simply about Cuba. It was about signaling. It was about reminding the world that Washington still believes it controls the rules of international commerce. The logic is simple, and it has governed global economics since the end of World War II. If you want to trade internationally, you need dollars. If you want dollars, you must comply with U.S. rules. If you refuse, you will be cut off from the global system. For decades, this worked. The U.S. dollar became the world's reserve currency. American banks became the arteries of global finance. Institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and SWIFT became enforcement mechanisms. Sanctions were not just punishments, they were economic death sentences. But something fundamental has changed. Each time Washington deploys sanctions today, it is no longer just punishing a target. It is teaching the rest of the world a lesson. Dependency on the dollar is a vulnerability. And over the last 72 hours, three countries acted on that lesson. Russia's move was the first signal and the most explicit. Instead of merely criticizing U.S.-cum sanctions, Moscow announced new energy agreements with Cuba that bypass the dollar entirely. Oil shipments are no longer settled in U.S. currency. Payments are structured through direct exchange mechanisms involving commodities, services, and non-dollar settlements. This is not symbolic. This is Russia exporting a model it was forced to build after being hit with unprecedented sanctions in 2014 and again in 2022. When Russia was cut off from Western financial systems, many analysts predicted collapse. That collapse never came. Instead, Russia rebuilt its trade architecture. It developed alternative payment systems. It reoriented trade toward Asia. It expanded non-dollar settlements. And most importantly, it learned how to function outside the system Washington controls. Now Russia is sharing that blueprint. By telling the world, we do not need your currency to trade, Moscow is challenging the central assumption of American power. This is not about helping Cuba. Cuba is the test case. The message is global. Then came China. And this is where the story shifts from defiance to transformation. Beijing announced massive lines of credit to Cuba denominated not in dollars, but in yuan. Chinese banks are financing energy infrastructure, port development, and industrial projects. Chinese companies are locking in long-term supply agreements for strategic minerals critical to battery production and high-tech manufacturing. This is not aid. This is architecture. China is not reacting emotionally to sanctions. It is methodically constructing an alternative economic system, one where capital flows without passing through New York, one where trade does not require dollar reserves, one where political compliance is not a prerequisite for economic cooperation. For over 2 decades, China has been laying the groundwork for this moment. Currency swap agreements, belt and road infrastructure, regional trade networks, alternative development banks. Each individual project seemed technical, boring, unremarkable. Taken together, they form a parallel world economy. And Cuba, once again, has become a proving ground. But here is where everything changes. Russia and China are expected challengers. They are openly positioned outside the Western Bloc. Their actions, while significant, do not fundamentally surprise Washington. Mexico does. Mexico shares a 3,000-kilometer border with the United States. Its economy is deeply integrated with American supply chains. Millions of jobs on both sides of the border depend on that relationship. For decades, Mexico has pursued cautious diplomacy, careful not to provoke retaliation. And yet, Mexico publicly declared that its commercial sovereignty is not subject to foreign sanctions. Let that sink in. Mexico did not threaten the United States. It did not break relations. It did not announce confrontation. It simply asserted a principle that should not be controversial. but is revolutionary in the current system. We will decide who we trade with. This is a direct challenge to the enforcement power of U.S. sanctions. It signals that even close partners are no longer willing to subordinate their national interests to Washington's geopolitical strategies. And Washington knows how dangerous that precedent is. This is not about Cuba. It has never been about Cuba. Cuba is the stage. The real drama is the erosion of American financial hegemony. For decades, the United States enjoyed what economists call the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. It could run massive deficits. It could print money. It could weaponize finance. And everyone else had to absorb the consequences. That privilege depended on one thing: universal participation. Once countries begin opting out, even partially, the system weakens. Once alternatives exist, sanctions lose effectiveness. Once trust erodes, power dissipates. And that is exactly what we are witnessing. Economist Richard Wolff describes sanctions for what they truly are: a form of war. Not war with bombs and soldiers, but war with food, medicine, and employment. The goal is not negotiation. The goal is pressure so intense that governments collapse from within. For a long time, sanctions worked because there was no escape. But today, escape routes exist. China is now the largest trading partner of more than 120 countries. When China offers credit, investment, and market access without political conditions, many countries listen. When Russia demonstrates that survival outside Western systems is possible, others take note. This does not mean China or Russia are benevolent actors. They are not. They pursue their own interests ruthlessly. But the monopoly is broken. Cuba is often portrayed as a failed state, but that narrative misses the point. Cuba has survived under embargo for over 60 years. Entire generations have lived their lives under economic siege, and yet the country did not collapse. It adapted. It developed healthcare and education systems that outperformed far wealthier nations in key metrics. It exported doctors instead of bombs. It learned how to operate with scarcity. And perhaps most importantly, it learned how to survive without U.S. approval. That is the real threat. Not Cuba's economy, not its politics, but its example. Because if a small country can survive outside the dollar system, others can too. Washington insists that sanctions are about democracy and human rights. But the pattern tells a different story. Authoritarian allies receive weapons and protection. Governments that nationalize resources or reject neoliberal models face punishment. The inconsistency is obvious, and the world is no longer ignoring it. Countries remember Iraq. They remember financial crises imposed through austerity. They remember agreements abandoned when administrations change. They remember promises broken. Legitimacy, once lost, is difficult to regain. What we are witnessing is not an American collapse, but an American adjustment. The world is becoming multipolar. Power is distributing. Influence must now be negotiated, not imposed. For ordinary Americans, this is not necessarily bad news. The empire did not enrich the working class. It enriched financial institutions, defense contractors, and multinational corporations. Deindustrialization, inequality, and insecurity followed. A world where the U.S. must compete rather than dominate may ultimately produce a healthier economy, but the transition will be painful. History shows that declining empires rarely step aside gracefully. They cling to power. They escalate. They mistake resistance for provocation. That is what makes this moment dangerous and full of possibility. The dollar is not collapsing tomorrow, but its unquestioned dominance is over. Alternatives now exist. Countries are acting on them. Russia, China, and Mexico did not coordinate publicly. They did not announce an alliance. But their actions converge on the same outcome. The rules are changing, and the world is watching. This is not abstract. Sanctions determine who eats, who gets medicine, who can access their own money. These decisions shape lives, not theories. What we are witnessing is the slow dismantling of a system built after World War II, a system that concentrated power in one center. That center is losing legitimacy, and something new is emerging in its place. A world with more voices, more paths, and fewer masters. That world is already being born.